Greetings, everyone. I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Taoist Center, and in this episode of Chinese Swords and Swordsmanship, we're going to look at Qing helmets. Now, anytime we're talking about Chinese swordsmanship or any kind of swordsmanship, context is always important. So you can, broadly speaking, break swordsmanship down into two categories. The first would be civilian swordsmanship. That's more like we might think of as something like dueling, one-on-one, or melees, or village versus village, not a military situation, not a battlefield situation, which is, of course, the other category, military or battlefield swordsmanship. Now, the big difference between the two is that dueling sort of swordsmanship, the civilian variety of sword play, it tends to be non-linear. You can move around, you have a freedom of movement, you may have to turn to engage different Duifang at different times, especially in a melee situation, and you have a real freedom of movement, or generally speaking, more freedom of movement than you do on a battlefield. Battlefield swordsmanship tends to be very linear because you're working in formation with your comrades. Different types of weapons are in use all around you. Maybe a shield with a saber, maybe spear, men with projectile weapons, with bows, with firearms, and all the different men, all the different units have to work together, and they're always facing an opponent, which is on the opposite side of the field. So your movements tend to be very linear. Now, of course, the other really big difference between civilian sort of swordsmanship, where you might be walking around or traveling through the countryside, and you have your sword with you, and you're attacked by bandits of some sort, and you have to quickly draw your weapon and use it one-on-one or one versus two. In that case, you're just in your regular clothing. When you're on the battlefield, you have on armor. So anytime you talk about military swordsmanship, you're also talking about men in armor, which of course brings us to the subject of this video, Qing helmets. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about how to wield a sword, the art of Chinese dueling, or battlefield swordsmanship, please have a look at the link below for the Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship. When we think about helmets and armor, we tend to think about the really fancy examples. If you go to a museum, you see those wonderful European full-plate armor with all the engraving and beautiful artwork on them. The Japanese helmets, which are sculptures and works of art on their own. Or if you go to the Forbidden City and see the emperor's armor, that is really high art. There's a lot of materials went into making those suits of armor. And they're beautiful, and they certainly were worn and used. However, those museum kind of pieces tend to give us misconceptions about arms and armor. We tend to think that that's what people wore. Well, some did. Those very high-ranking knights or emperors or generals, they always had really good armor, very well-made armor, often using precious materials. But the average soldier, the guys in the front line, the boys really doing the fighting, they tended not to have nearly as much armor or as well-made armor. They tend to have armor more like this. This is a helmet made of rattan. And indeed, all sorts of armor, especially shields, but also body armor, and a variety of helmets were made of rattan. And the reason for that is really quite obvious. One thing, imagine you have to equip 10,000 men, 20,000 men, 50,000 men with helmets and armor. Steel helmets are really expensive. You have to mine the iron, you have to refine it into steel. You have to train armorers for years so they're able to treat that steel, heat treat it properly, and then to be able to really shape it into a steel helmet like this. That's an expensive, long process. Any peasant who could make a decent basket could be trained to make a helmet like this. So you have a highly skilled laborer versus a skilled laborer, but a much more common skill to make rattan armor. And rattan armor has a long, long history in China. There's Ming Dynasty examples you can see in the military manuals of the period where there are helmets in a variety of shapes. There's armor, and of course, very well known as the tongue pie shields, the rattan shields that were really ubiquitous from the Ming Dynasty into the Qing. These helmets and armor were made by first soaking the rattan and then drying it, repeatedly soaking and drying, and then oiling it with tung oil. So it becomes very weather resistant and tough. And if we take a look at this helmet, for example, we can see that, first of all, it's got more than one layer. Inside, there's this interwoven layer of fairly broad pieces, about a centimeter wide. And then on top, it has these strips, these kind of little plates that run all the way around. And that's very similar to the earlier helmets, the Ming and Yuan period helmets that also had these plates that went around, and they could be 8 or more, sometimes many plates just like this. Now, of course, it's easy to make steel plates fairly wide, but rattan being a much thinner material, they're making many, many, many small little plates that overlap that go all the way around the helmet. They're locked into place on the top by this extra reinforcement. So you've got two layers. You've got this inner layer, the woven layer. You've got this outer layer, the strips that go all the way around. And then on the top, you have this 5-sided sort of a pentagram here with these woven pieces in between. It really ties it all together very tightly, very strong. So the apex of the helmet is really quite strong. Any blow hitting this won't cut it. It'll bounce off of this. And you have strips going perpendicular to the ones that come down the helmet. Also, if we look at the edge looking around, that is again reinforced. And you may look at this and go, hey, that just looks like a hat. And yeah, in many ways it is just a hat in ways. And that's actually another really good feature of this. When you're out on the march with the common soldier, first of all, a helmet on your head is heavier, it's got padding, it's going to get hot. If you're in southern China particularly, where it's really quite hot and humid, armor is really problematic. Your body tends to overheat. This is going to keep the sun off of you. It's going to keep the rain off of you. So it does have that extra function as being just a hat as well as a helmet. But unlike just a simple hat that a peasant would have, it has this extra reinforcing on top we just looked at. And you can see all along the edge here, there is this extra reinforced rim that is, again, bound with little strips of rattan, and it has this braided band that goes around that reinforces that. So this altogether is quite strong. This helmet is well over 100 years old, and I have practiced test cutting on a faithful reproduction of a Qing-style rattan shield, and I can tell you, 7 blows landing within an inch from each other, full power, solid blows, barely dented it. So that was 7 blows hitting within just 1 square inch, barely dented the shield. This is every bit as strong, I believe. So there's no way that a single blow is going to come through this helmet. So overall, this is a really, really smart way, a really good alternative for the Qing to arm their soldiers, their frontline soldiers. It's inexpensive. It's relatively easy to make. It's of a material that you just grow. You just grow the rattan. You don't have to mine iron. And it serves more than one function. It works well as a hat as well as a helmet. As a practitioner of historical swordsmanship, of Chinese swordsmanship, I find things like this really very interesting because it's telling me what was it like for the average swordsman. For that guy who was in the front line, who was really fighting, what was their life like? What were they really armed with? What was their kit? But I hope you enjoyed this episode of Chinese Swords and Swordsmanship. I really enjoyed showing you this. If you did, please make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell. And please have a look at the link for the Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship. Until next time, thanks and 再见.